Hi everyone, so today we are going to talk about my absolute favorite topic, which is practical management of the Easy Keeper and EMS horse. So my name is Madeline and I'm an independent equine nutritionist. I run Balanced Bay. Like most of you, I grew up totally horse crazy, which led me to pursue a 4-year bachelor's degree in equine management. During this time, my lovely mare Piper, who is pictured here, was injured, and with being an easy keeper and not an exercise, she then gained weight, and trying to manage her weight during this time was really frustrating. And I was frustrated by the just feed her less. You just need to feed her less. And so I decided to pursue a master's degree in equine nutrition, specifically looking at how horses gain and deposit weight differently and then lose weight in various weight loss programs. After my master's degree, I launched Balanced Bay. I then have continued with getting my professional animal scientist designation in the equine field, and I'm currently working towards a PhD in equine nutrition with my thesis focusing on equine obesity and inflammation. So I love to talk about easy keepers. And with the term easy keepers, I would like to start by saying just because they hold weight easily does not mean their management is. I stand by that these horses are the most difficult to manage frequently. And easy keeper is a bit of a misleading term. But when we talk about keeper statuses, we're really talking about a horse's digestible energy requirement. So easy keepers are often referred to as thrifty. We see often our ponies in this category, breeds like Morgans and Fjords and Halflingers, whereas harder keepers generally require more calorie supplementation than the average horse to maintain their weight. So the NRC, the nutrient requirements of horses, does provide averages. So if we look at the range that we have of a 500 kilogram horse that is not in work, an easy keeper would be about 15.2 mcals per day, whereas a harder keeper would be about 18.2. And we'll get into a few more calorie examples to provide some more meaning to these numbers a little bit later. So I'm sure we have all joked about fat ponies and, oh, look at how chunky my horse is. And it's common, but we do need to remember it's a serious welfare issue. Just like an underweight horse is a welfare issue, an overweight horse is a welfare issue just the same. Currently, our published research estimates that about 30 to 50% of the domestic equine population is obese, depending on geographic region. That's huge. And so many health issues are associated with obesity. We have exercise intolerance, poor thermoregulation. These horses have an increased risk of development of lipomas in the GI tract. They also have a greater risk of developing insulin resistance or insulin dysregulation, and there's systemic inflammation in their body. So fat is not just doing nothing in the body. It is a metabolically active tissue that is negatively impacting the horse when it is in excess. So when we take a look at managing these horses, we generally start by looking at their diet. I want everybody to think about what you feed your horse in a day by weight. So if you had to collect everything that your horse was consuming in a day, it would probably look something like this. Probably a lot of hay and a little bit of concentrate. And so if this is what their diet looks like and forges the majority of their diet, we really need to know what the nutritional content of that hay is. And the only way to do this is with hay testing. So this is a hay corer here that's pulling a sample. I offer hay testing. Many feed brand reps will as well. If you contact your local feed store, you can also take the sample yourself. So it forges the base of the diet. To have accurate nutritional management for these more complicated easy keepers or metabolic horses, we need to be testing our hay. The only situations where hay testing really isn't practical is if you're getting new batches of hay very, very frequently. So every couple of weeks or kind of within a 3-month period, you're having multiple new batches of hay. If you're getting hay a couple of times a year or twice a year, once a year, then we definitely need to be testing our hay. The investment is well worth it. With testing hay, I find that the most popular question is, oh, what's the starch and sugar content? And yes, of course, that's really important, but I think digestible energy or the calorie content of hay is very frequently overlooked. So generally we see the range between 1.9 and 2.3 mcals per kilo. If we look at specific balanced bay data, so this is Ontario hay analyses, in 2024, the range was 1.5 to 2.5 mcals per kilo. Now, I understand those numbers are not very meaningful, so I've included some examples. So if we have a 500 kilogram horse that is consuming 2% of their body weight in hay per day, they'll be eating 10 kilograms of hay. If we look at the low end of the range, this would be 15 mcals per day. And on the high end, 25. Now let's look down here at the bottom. So let's say all of these horses weigh 500 kilograms. Our Easy Keeper not in work is going to be needing 15.2 mcals per day. Now, if this horse is on the low end quality hay, that's great. We don't probably need to restrict it. They can have their hay and their ration balancer and maintain a healthy body condition. However, if this horse is on the richer hay, it's just going to be essentially impossible to use that hay as that horse's primary source of forage, because when you restrict it, the restriction would have to be so severe that we would then end up having secondary problems. So really considering the calorie content of your hay is important. Now, if you're testing your hay on your own and you're not working directly with a nutritionist, sometimes getting into all the nitty-gritty calorie calculations is complicated and time-consuming. So we can also rely on grading our hay quality. So this grading system relies primarily on relative feed value, which is determined with acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber primarily. So the grading system is 1 to 5. A grade of 5 is really poor quality hay, and a grade 1 is premium quality hay. And if you have an Easy Keeper or EMS horse, we generally want our hay to sit in this grade 3 or 4 range, so it's called utility hay. Now, premium hay is fabulous for horses that have really high nutritional needs. Weanlings, lactating mares, upper level performance horses. And I've included the ADF and NDF values here. Now, good hay is going to be a step down from that, and this is best for lower level performance horses, yearlings. It's good, but it's not extremely rich. Now, our utility hay is really where we want to be focusing. So the relative feed value of utility hay ranges from about 75 to 102. And this is ideal for our Easy Keepers. So it's going to be more mature, mid to late bloom, a little bit coarser than something that's going to be premium. However, testing is important because we don't want poor quality hay. So poor quality hay is very mature. The relative feed value is going to be below 74. Sometimes we use this for donkeys as it works well for them. But relying on poor quality hay for a horse's primary forage source is not recommended because it increases the risk of impaction colic. So we don't want to be feeding this as the primary forage source. That being said, if you test your hay and it's sitting in this poor range, we can make it work by adding digestible fiber sources like hay cubes, ensuring hydration, maybe buying in a secondary hay source and combining them. So there's lots of options, whether you have premium, good, utility, poor quality hay, we can generally work with it. So when we look at testing hay, safety is important, and we're going to talk about starch and sugar more in the metabolic section. But it's important for safety with sugar content and also fiber digestibility, which is what we've talked about in regards to the calorie content. The other point I want to make that isn't specific to Easy Keepers, but something that I like all horse owners to think about, is preventing nutrition-related issues with continual optimized nutrition. So the pattern that I see every year is that, let's say in Ontario, around the beginning of September, horses start consuming the New Year's hay. So let's say September, horses in Ontario will start consuming hay that was harvested in 2026. Then around the start of November, I start getting an influx of calls of my horse has gained a bunch of weight suddenly, my horse has lost a bunch of weight, my horse lost their top line, I don't know what happened, their muscle mass is decreasing. And all of these cases, if it's not a health issue, it is generally related to a change in the quality of the forage. Because as we previously talked about, forage is the majority of the ration most of the time. So if you have a large change in quality, you're going to impact your horse's nutrition. The continual optimized nutrition piece is that even when hay is changing, we have higher quality, lower quality year over year, we can adjust what we're feeding in terms of hay cubes, concentrates, supplements to have a continual balanced and optimized ration. So this is just an example of what a hay analysis might look like. This will vary lab to lab, but you essentially have your dry matter at the top with crude protein. We then have our chunk of, I like to call them digestibility parameters, so our acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, and lignin, which these all relate to the digestible energy content or calorie content of the hay. We will then have a chunk of minerals here, and our starch and sugar will be at the bottom. So we do not test hay for me to tell you that you need to get rid of your hay. The hay you have is generally the hay you have. So we're going to talk about various tactics of if it is too rich for your easy keeper, what to do. But I don't want you to shy away from hay testing because you're nervous about the hay not being ideal for your horse. There are so many things that we can do to get creative on how to take a hay that is not ideal, but it is what you have, and make it work for your horse. So I really want to stress that because a lot of people will say, well, why test my hay when I can't change it? There are so many reasons to test your hay, even if you can't change it. So beyond the real focus on forage, we also have this piece of friends and freedom. So when we manage a horse and talk about welfare, we generally look at the 3 F's: forage, friends, and freedom. So we touched on already that obesity is a welfare issue. It increases the incidence of a lot of health issues. And yeah, at the end of the day, it's a welfare issue just as much as a horse that's underweight. Now, what we often do is we are trying to fix one problem, we might create additional problems. So with managing an easy keeper, we need to keep it practical, but we also need to not cause other welfare issues while we're trying to fix the obesity. So really considering how we can prioritize the 3 F's in their management without just letting the horse continue to be obese. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of management is slow feeders and automatic feeders. So slow feeders restrict the access to hay. So oftentimes there'll be a net or a grate or a plastic insert in these feeders. And essentially they are restricting the horse from being able to take large mouthfuls at a time. So the horse is going to consume smaller amounts at a time and chew for longer. The other technology that we have that's a little bit newer is automatic feeders. So these feeders deliver a certain portioned amount of feed or hay on a consistent schedule. So both of these options can work depending on your facility and depending on your individual horse. And I want to stress that there is not one perfect setup for every horse. It depends on your facility, your management, your herd, all of the above. There's so many factors. But definitely we want to be making sure that we're avoiding fasting periods. So we do not want the horse to have a fasting period longer than 4 hours. And we want to increase chew time whenever we can. So the other piece of equipment is grazing muzzles. So grazing muzzles are designed to reduce pasture intake for horses prone to obesity, laminitis, and metabolic issues. However, that is not what I personally use them for most of the time in Ontario. I also use them to restrict hay intake. So if we think about our forage freedom and friends, in order to restrict our horse's hay intake, it might be suggested that we remove them from their herd. They might have to go on a dry lot. They might not be able to be out with their friends anymore. And yes, we're fixing the obesity problem, but we have now removed them from the herd environment, which we know is so critical to welfare and well-being. So I want to use my own herd as an example. So I have my Easy Keeper Piper that we've already chatted about, and she lives with a 30-year-old quarter horse, Finnegan, who has PPID and is a harder keeper, and they also live with a donkey. So I have easy keepers and a hard keeper. And how do you manage that? So what I do is I put their hay in a slow feeder. So they have their hay in a slow feeder that restricts intake to a certain extent, and it is utility quality hay. I then supplement my hard keeper Finnegan with digestible fiber and calories as needed. But then my easy keepers wear a grazing muzzle. So I've tried all of these. I will note that I have clients successfully using every type of muzzle listed on this slide. I personally right now am using the nuzzle on my mare Piper and my donkey. And so essentially what I'm doing is I'm doubling up the hay net for two of the animals, but not for my harder keeper. Another situation is I have actually a couple of horses that have either the green guard or the thin line flexible filly, and they live out in a paddock with their friends and 24/7 access to forage, but the muzzle slows down their intake without having to net or restrict the hay for the rest of the horses. So lots of different ways that we can alter management, even if we're working within the constraints of a boarding facility, because that is the reality. We need to work within the management constraints to have a practical program. And if it's not practical, it's pointless. So it does really need to be practical to implement. The last management strategy I like to talk about that isn't frequently mentioned is using straw. So barley, oat, and wheat straw are used as a partial hay replacement, generally in either of these two situations. So if the horse needs to lose weight and the available hay is too rich, or if the hay is not necessarily super rich, but when we reduce the amount for the horse, that their daily hay allotment is not sufficient to prevent prolonged fasting periods. So if they're eating their hay too quickly, that they end up with a fasting period longer than 4 hours, we need to make a change. And so those are two options when straw can be really valuable. Research-wise, there are studies that show that replacing up to 50% of, I believe ponies were used in the study, of a pony's hay allotment per day with straw is safe. However, straw is really high in indigestible fiber, so I personally am only comfortable up to 25%. I have seen that 10 to 25% is often sufficient to create a calorie deficit for these horses. Now, I will note that you can just add straw to your horse's daily hay ration. So if we have a good management program, our horse is maintaining their weight well, they're not overweight, but they're eating their hay too quickly. So if we increased hay, they would become overweight. Then we could add some straw. We don't necessarily have to do the replacement. But if we are replacing it, I really don't want to be over 25%. Technically, you could go up to 50%. It's generally not necessary, though. If you have additional questions about straw and this strategy, I do recommend working with a nutritionist. Just from a safety standpoint, having someone actually do all these calculations for you is really valuable. So, an easy keeper doesn't always indicate an underlying metabolic condition. So, at the beginning of the presentation, I said we're going to talk about easy keepers and metabolic cases, and they are not one and the same. There are differences, although frequently they go hand in hand. So, equine metabolic syndrome, often we have fat pads, sometimes like different fat pads that are really prominent. So often we'll see a really crusty neck on these horses. And really what's happening is the body's response to insulin is impacted. So not all obese horses have EMS or an insulin dysregulation, and not all horses that present with EMS with having insulin dysregulation are obese. These are examples of two obese horses. We can see very problematic fat pads here, but this horse on the right is also quite overweight. We can see the fat collecting down the neck here, which is quite concerning. Now, when we talk about metabolic problems, the other disease that comes up is PPID, or Cushing's disease. So this is an endocrine-related disease that commonly affects older horses, and these horses will have an overproduction of pituitary hormones that can cause metabolic dysfunction. So not all horses with Cushing's disease have insulin resistance, but many of them do. The symptoms will be abnormal coat, muscle loss, impaired immune function, and working with your veterinarian very, very closely is going to be critical, whether your horse has EMS or has PPID, or even is just an easy keeper, and we want to get a baseline for some of these medical issues. So let's zoom out. Let's start with what are we actually trying to do when we're managing a metabolic horse or a horse that has insulin dysregulation. So we're trying to manage the glycemic response, and I want to explain this as basic as I can make it, because I think it's really important if you have a metabolic horse, a horse that has insulin dysregulation, to understand. So when a horse consumes a meal that contains hydrolyzable carbohydrates, so that would be like our water-soluble carbs and starch, this results in glucose entering the bloodstream. So they eat the feed or the hay, glucose is entering the bloodstream. When glucose enters the bloodstream, the pancreas is then signaled to release insulin. And so insulin is the hormone that stimulates the cells to uptake that glucose so that the horse can use it for energy. The glucose level in the blood is then decreased as it is taken into the cells for use. When our glucose levels decreases, the pancreas then reduces insulin secretion and all levels return to baseline. So that is what happens in a normal, healthy horse. If we look at a horse that has insulin dysregulation, the horse is going to consume a meal and we're going to have glucose entering the bloodstream. When the glucose enters the bloodstream, the pancreas is then signaled to release insulin. However, the cells don't react properly to the insulin. And so therefore, the cells aren't adequately taking up the glucose from the blood. So we're having the pancreas continue to release insulin, which leads to this hyperinsulinemia that we see in metabolic horses. This is a graph showing insulin response for EMS horses after a meal. And as you can see, their insulin levels peak much higher and stay elevated for longer compared to a healthy horse. So yeah, there's lots of papers showing really good visuals on this. In reality, I wish we could measure a glucose and insulin curve on every horse that we suspect has a metabolic problem, but of course, that's just not super practical yet. So when we talk about this starch and sugar intake, we have to talk about the great debate between water-soluble carbohydrates and ethanol-soluble carbs. If you have done any reading online about managing a metabolic horse, you have probably seen conflicting advice on this topic. So water-soluble carbohydrates include our simple sugars, our short-chain polysaccharides, and fructans. Simple sugars are digested in the foregut, so our stomach and small intestine, and they're going to directly impact that glycemic response that we just talked about. The fructans are digested in the hindgut and have a lesser impact on the glycemic response. On the other hand, or within that subcategory, so we then have ethanol-soluble carbs, which is our simple sugars and short-chain polysaccharides, but not our fructans. So fructans are excluded from this calculation. Non-structural carbohydrates, so our NSC, is water-soluble carbs and starch. However, I will say that there are There is much debate around if we can just rely on ethanol-soluble carbs instead of including fructans for our metabolic horses. And I would say right now, we just don't know yet. We don't have the science to definitively say one way or the other. So, hay for metabolic horses. We need to test our hay before feeding it. And the before feeding it part is really critical. If you haven't tested your hay, we'll get it. We'll get on it. We'll get your hay tested. And then for your next batch of hay, we'll make sure that we're planning to test it while you still have overlap, so we know what we're working with before it ever reaches your horse's mouth. The sugar content is, of course, critical for safety. So our ESC and starch versus WSC and starch, normally what we're looking for is below 10%, in that 10 to 12 range. However, this is just a guideline. Some metabolic horses will be fine on 13 or 14% NSC hay. Some need 7% hay, NSC hay. So it really depends on your individual horse, which is another plug for hay testing on know what your horse does well on. Is just so critical when we're talking about effective long-term management. Now, if we have hay that is too high in starch and sugar, we can soak it to reduce this amount. So studies have reported sugar losses of about 12 to 45% after 60 minutes and 30 to 48% after 12 hours. So based on the current literature, the recommendation is to soak hay for 1 hour in cold water or 30 minutes in hot water. The hay does need to be completely submerged though. So if you have like a Tupperware container or a garbage can and you're sticking your hay in and you're filling it up with cold water, it often will float and stick out the top. So we need to be weighing that hay down so it's completely submerged to have effective soaking. So switching gears from hay, I want to talk about concentrates for metabolic horses. Previously, we used to rely on the NSC percentage, similar to what we still currently rely on for hay, but that is a dated recommendation. We have better science now, thanks to Erica Macon. She's at Texas A&M now and is doing brilliant work on metabolic horses. So we should be relying on grams of NSC per kilo body weight per meal. So we want it to be less than 0.1 grams per kilo body weight per meal. And this is an example calculation on how to figure out if your horse's ration is meeting that safety guideline. So what Erica was able to show is that if we follow this guideline, our metabolic horses don't have an exacerbated insulin response after eating their meal in comparison to healthy horses. So really neat stuff. And we shouldn't be relying on just a blanket percentage anymore when we're looking at concentrates for these animals. So let's do a checklist for the metabolic horse. Test your hay before feeding. Look at your sugar content, follow the concentrate recommendations. And what about pasture? It depends. I don't have one clear recommendation for pasture. It depends on the individual case, whether or not that horse can safely consume some level of pasture. That one would be something that you need to consult with your own nutritionist or veterinarian on. So I want to just zoom back out a little bit to the making management practical piece with a bit of a structured approach and some take-home messages. So I always start with a hay analysis when feasible and a balanced diet. We didn't talk about balancing a ration as that would take far too long to fit everything into one presentation. But don't feed supplements that compromise the foundational nutrition. Make sure your horse's vitamin and mineral and protein requirements are met. You can use a ration balancer or a vitamin mineral premix if your hay is adequate protein content. For a horse at maintenance or in light work, we ideally want around 10% crude protein. So that is the guiding decision often between if we're doing a ration balancer or a vitamin mineral premix for the very easy keeper. We want to take time to regularly evaluate our horse's body condition. Equine Guelph has a fabulous body condition scoring course that you can take online. I highly recommend it. And then I recommend updating your horse's measurements every time the farrier comes out. So that is a regular occurrence that happens in your horse's life, whether that's every 4, 6, 8 weeks. Make farrier day measurement day so that we're staying on a regular schedule and noticing small weight changes before they become a welfare problem. And don't be afraid to try different management tactics. Combine them, try a whole bunch of different things. Really, there's lots of options. I don't think I can think of any easy keeper that I've worked with that has the exact same plan, because so much of it depends on their individual preferences, your preferences, the management style of the facility that you're at or that you have. And working within that, at the end of the day, I want my clients to be really happy with what they're feeding their horses and feel good about the program. And so we need to make that work for you and be practical. The last piece, which I didn't really focus on in this, but if you join my email list before the 1st of April, you will be getting a research paper sent out specifically looking at exercise for these horses. And I'll touch on this briefly. If you have a horse that is currently laminitic, obviously they cannot exercise. However, if your Easy Keeper or EMS horse is healthy to exercise, this can make a really big difference in weight loss and make it a whole lot easier. In the research that I was involved in my master's, we found that if you exercise the horse for 20 minutes at a moderate intensity, so like an active trot, 20 minutes, 5 days a week, that makes a statistically significant difference in weight loss. So it's not a lot of work that is required, but anytime we can be increasing exercise in intensity and frequency as well, but really that intensity piece is important, that's really positive. And that means your horse can probably have a bit more forage in their ration, so it can help with that forage piece of the 3 Fs. So obesity is a welfare issue. I do want to highlight that again. We need to be evaluating both the horse's concentrated feed and forage and ensure we're feeding within safe guidelines, and prioritize the 3 Fs. Of course, if you are unsure about any aspects of your horse's nutrition, or if you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to reach out. I wish I could be there in person, but unfortunately not this time. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them over email. So thank you so much for listening. And yes, these are my 2 lovely balanced bays, Piper and Finn, because I always like to share horse pictures when possible. So yeah, thanks so much for listening. And I hope you learned some information about practical management and how we can do better for these horses.